Judith Herrin, the author of Ravenna, Capital of Empire, Crucible of Europe. And I'm utterly delighted to be talking at the Lahore Literary Festival. Thank you very much for this invitation, which is a great honor and a great pleasure. I'm talking about a book which sounds as if it's about a city, Ravenna, which is in northeastern Italy. But actually, it's about a whole period from the 4th to the 8th centuries AD, in which Ravenna was one of the major centers of civilization, of contact across the Mediterranean world. And I've tried to show how this city embodies some of the enormous developments that took place in a period which I think should be identified as early Christendom. This is because during this period, we see the development of the eruption of the development of Islam and the arrival of the Muslim faith in what had been a Christian, previously pagan, Greco-Roman world. And this enormous change forced the Christian world to adapt to a new enemy, a new rival, because of course Islam intended to replace both Judaism and Christianity, although it venerated the same God, Allah. It did not accept the other previous revelations. And in the course of this momentous development, Western Christian identity became separated from that of the East Mediterranean Greek Orthodox identity. And there were many rivalries and quarrels in this process of separation. Because in the East, Constantinople, the new Rome, which had been founded by Constantine the Great, was deeply threatened, immediately threatened by Islam. These momentous conquests and the consequences of these conquests, which meant that the Muslims overtook the eastern provinces of the old Roman Empire, Egypt, the primary breadbasket of Constantinople, Syria, Palestine, and then all along the southern coast of the Mediterranean, Libya, Tunisia, current contemporary Morocco, right over the Straits of Gibraltar and into Spain. This enclosure of the southern and eastern parts of the Mediterranean by Muslim forces was deeply, deeply threatening to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Constantinople and the emperors of Constantinople. Whereas in Ravenna, which was not immediately threatened in this period, there was a greater self-confidence in the Latin Catholic faith, which was defining itself in separation from the Eastern revelation. So in looking at the history of Ravenna, I try to show how through this city we can see these developments. And the exceptional quality of this city and its character is based on three particular factors. These are the symbiosis of a Germanic Gothic tradition, warlike, previously pagan, then converted to Christian belief, and the Roman imperial tradition of the whole of Italy, which had been deeply embedded over centuries with its emphasis on the legal systems, a tax system that works, an efficient administration, a very strong defense against barbarian, i.e. non-Roman elements, and the inspiration of Constantinople, the new Rome, the imperial capital of the emperors who lived in Constantinople, today Istanbul, in contemporary Turkey, who sustained the imperial traditions in their Greek form, because during this period, Latin ceased to be the lingua franca of the East Mediterranean and was completely replaced by Greek. and which developed its own culture and its own civilization, which was to endure to the year 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. So these three elements, the Germanic, the Roman imperial, and the Constantinopolitan inspiration, meet in Ravenna, and they make it an exceptional city during the period of the 5th to 8th centuries. Many, many cities had existed in the old Roman Empire of the West, not just imperial Rome, but many other great cities, and nearly all of them experienced tremendous decline as the non-Roman forces overran these provinces. The areas of Gaul and Spain and parts of Italy were completely conquered and overcome by non-Roman forces. And Ravenna too was conquered, but it was conquered by Theoderic the Goth. And very interestingly, Theoderic had been held hostage in Constantinople as a young man for about a decade. And can you imagine growing up in Constantinople as a Goth, a Christian, but of the wrong persuasion, because the Goths had been converted to Arian Christianity, a form that had been condemned as heretical at church councils, and which was despised and pushed aside by the majority faith of the Orthodox Greeks in Constantinople, the Christians who celebrated in the great church of Hagia Sophia, their cathedral in Constantinople. And they forced the Arian Goths to go and worship in churches outside the city walls, a good long ride or walk away from the center. And there they could celebrate their own Arian liturgy using Gothic, because their great missionary bishop, Ulfilas, had translated the Bible and the liturgies and the hymns and the sermons that you need to celebrate Christianity into the Gothic language. He invented the Gothic alphabet so that this could happen, and the Goths continued to sing the Psalms in Gothic, we hear. So we know that there was a real live Gothic Arian Christianity, which existed in a tiny minority, of course, within the larger Greek Orthodox world. But that Arian identity was deeply embedded among the Goths, because when they had been converted in the 4th century to this Arian heretical form, they knew it to be the correct Christianity. They believed they had the proper doctrines, they knew what they celebrated, they understood the relationship of God the Father to God the Son and God the Holy Spirit. And they celebrated in their own language, in their own way, quite confident in their beliefs. So when Theoderic, who had been a witness to the ceremonies and the processions and the civilization and the learning of Constantinople as a young man, when he returned to his people and decided after many years to take them away from their Balkan homeland, which wasn't a homeland, it was north of the Danube. It was not a wealthy, rich environment. And he negotiated with the Emperor Zeno to lead his people into North Italy in order to remove another non-Roman ruler who had occupied parts of northern Italy and settled in Ravenna. And so Theoderic set off with his people through the Balkans, across the plain of Hungary, over the Julian Alps into northern Italy, and established himself as the ruler, the king of a Gothic kingdom which embraced all of Italy, most of southern Gaul, eventually all of Spain, and large parts of the Balkans and the Adriatic coast of Dalmatia and Croatia. And Theoderic brought his impressions of Constantinople to the West and built himself a little mini Constantinople in Ravenna. And we see it in his magnificent Arian church, the one that survives, of St. Apollinare Nuovo, with incredible mosaics, which draw on the imperial traditions of mosaic decoration, which had already been installed in Ravenna in the 5th century earlier by the Empress Galla Placidia and her successors. So we know that there were a very skilled group of craftsmen in Ravenna who could place these magnificent mosaics all over the walls of very large churches and in the apses and roofs, many of them on a gold ground that glistened in the candlelight. So there was a very spectacular culture that grew up in Ravenna, drawing on this Germanic tradition inspired from Constantinople, which also linked itself very, very closely to the Roman traditions that Theoderic found in Italy. And these, as I say, were based very much on efficient administration, record keeping, getting the taxes in, paying the Goths to fight, defend the kingdom, and asking the Romans and the local people to produce both the taxation and the produce which would feed the Gothic inhabitants. And through this process, there was a gradual symbiosis of two very, very different traditions, which gave incredible strength to the city of Ravenna as the center of this kingdom. One of the aspects which Theoderic understood very clearly was that as a minority, his Gothic people who'd followed him, many of them, and many of them not his particular followers, but other Germanic tribes people who wished to get away from the Balkans and settle in sunny Italy. Who doesn't wish to do that? They were a minority, and their king realized that they had to come to an agreement with the majority, who were Catholic, that is Orthodox Christians, who believed that they too had the correct Christianity, which had been approved at church councils, which was accepted by all the bishops in Italy, and was obviously a great force in the West. And Theoderic therefore decided that the Gothic bishops would administer to the Gothic people in Gothic church. There were two systems, both the Gothic Arian system and the Catholic Orthodox system. And although in many cases where these Gothic and Catholic traditions had come into conflict, and there were terrible rival processions, both in Constantinople and in Milan, Christians were fighting each other over these, sometimes over the possession of churches, as well as the true faith and the correct doctrine. In Ravenna, Theoderic established that the Goths would have their own churches and their own bishops, and the local people would have theirs. And he also established that the Jewish population, and we learn that there were synagogues, plural, in Ravenna, as in most big cities in Western Europe at the time, that the Jews should be allowed to celebrate their faith too. And he laid down a very important rule when he said, I disapprove of your faith. I think it's wrong, but I cannot force any man to believe against his will. So you go on with your erroneous beliefs, and we will let you be. But you may not extend your synagogues. You may just maintain and replace them if they get damaged. And when on occasion there were attacks on the synagogues, Theoderic established that the local Catholic bishop should assist with funds and manpower to rebuild them. So there was an actual result from this toleration. There were consequences that flowed from it. which I think are very useful to remember when we think about why Ravenna was so different from other cities. I think one of the most interesting things that I discovered when writing about this city was that it had so many unexpected features. I discovered, for example, that there were a school of Greek doctors who practiced a type of medicine that was considered different from the Latin doctors. That is to say, they were doctors who were familiar with the Greek traditions dating back to Galen and even further back. And they probably got their information from the great medical school in Alexandria. We learn that some of them, these doctors, came from the East Mediterranean. And I feel quite sure that they had studied either in Alexandria or in other centers where the Alexandrian principles were very developed. And that was all in Greek. And then there was a school of Latin doctors who did not have that tradition. They had their own, they had some translations of Greek medicine, but very few. And they represented a different school. And because sometimes there were quarrels between the doctors, perhaps brought by disaffected patients who hadn't had the right cures, there was a special official who had to settle any disputes between them. But it's interesting to think that there was a whole school of Greek medicine inspired from Alexandria in 6th and 7th century Ravenna. Most unusual. Then there was another very surprising discovery. There were certain figures, presumably men, presumably very cultivated, possibly monks, who were very interested in cosmography. And cosmography was not just about how the world works, it was how the world came into existence and of what it consisted. And one of these figures, who is only known as the anonymous cosmographer, because we do not have his name, but I think it is a man, wrote an account of what the Bible tells us about how the world came into existence for his brother Odo. And he speaks of this most nobilissima, most noble Ravenna as his home, his base. But he says quite openly, I've not traveled in these places. I've not been to India, Mauritius, nor to the far north, to Scotia. So he knows about these places, but he hasn't traveled there. His learning has come from books and from manuscripts he's consulted in Ravenna. So there must have been some very big libraries. And he writes about how the world came into existence, which of course he knows from the book of Genesis at the beginning of the Bible. God created the world in 7 days. And then he traces what is known of the Far East, which is where Eden is situated. And of course, nobody knows about the Garden of Eden except that there are palm trees that spread wonderful scents through the air, and it is a blissful place. But nobody's been there. Further to the west, and then he moves gradually west. He spends quite a lot of time in India and Persia, and he knows quite a lot about the history of those countries in the Roman tradition. That is, Alexander conquered large parts of the world, and he went as far as the Indus, and so on. He also knows, because he has records of all the cities in the provinces of the Roman Empire. So as soon as he gets beyond Persia, moving westward, he comes into the provinces of the Roman Empire that existed in the extreme east, that abutted Persia, the great enemy of Rome. And there he can talk about the rivers and the mountains and the peoples who live in these provinces. Many of these are lists of cities with their names, but others actually, he has some detours about the people who live in these cities and their customs and some of their languages and how they write things differently. And he has quite interesting information about the extreme far north, Ultima Thule and Britannia. He says Britannia is said to be in Europa. Thank goodness for that. But he knows quite a lot, and he seems to have got his learning from books. And this anonymous cosmographer fascinates me, because although he doesn't appear to have made maps, he must have had some sense of plotting where these provinces of the Roman Empire were and where the cities were. And I do wonder if he used ancient maps like the Tabula Peutingeriana, which was certainly a late Roman list of journeys that you make within the Roman Empire, moving from one place to the other. For example, how to get from Spain to Egypt. That's a very long way. And you need to go along the routes, which are imperial roads laid down by Roman emperors and maintained provinces, over the bridges. This is not, it's not a maritime route, it's a land route. And it's going to take you a very long time to walk or ride all that way. But these journeys are marked by visits to cities and places where you can stop overnight and get a meal and change the horses. And sometimes there are cities with baths where you can rest and so on. So there are facilities which the anonymous knows about. Anyway, that was just another of the very extraordinary discoveries I made. But I think one of the most telling things about the city of Ravenna is that eventually it was conquered by other non-barbarian people, Lombards. But between 540 and 751, it was governed by exarchs appointed from Constantinople. So there was a long, long period of imperial control based in Ravenna. And when that ended, because the Lombards finally captured Ravenna, the city retreated from its central position and shrank back into a more regular urban setting with a very, very powerful church led by bishops who had their hands on incredible wealth, many estates scattered through the Adriatic and down as far as Sicily, on which they drew on for taxes and actual produce. So Ravenna was not a poor city, but it did lose its central position after 751. And when the great King Charles of the Franks, whom we know as Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus, Karl der Grosse, when he went to Italy, he visited Ravenna on 3 occasions. And on the first occasion, he asked the bishop if he might remove some of the columns and marbles from dilapidated buildings, possibly churches, possibly imperial palaces, because Ravenna had been full of palaces since it had served as the capital of the Roman Empire, since it had served as the headquarters of the king, the Gothic king, and then these exarchs who built their own grand palaces. And the bishop who was entertaining Charles in his very large and very beautifully decorated refectory, dining hall, which adjoined his church, gave his permission, as did the Pope in Rome. And Charles was able to order the transport of large slabs of marble and capitals and columns to his new capital city in Aachen, where he had them re-erected to decorate his new palace and church there. And when he went to Ravenna, I feel quite sure that he stood in front of the mosaics in the church of San Vitale, which are very spectacular panels of the Emperor Justinian I and opposite the Empress Theodora. And it's extremely important to remember that although Constantinople was absolutely full of images of these very important rulers. None of them survived in Constantinople. And whenever you read about Justinian and Theodora, you see illustrations which are drawn from these wonderful mosaics in San Vitale Church in Ravenna that was founded starting around the year 520 and completed in rededicated in 547. So over a long period, this church, dedicated to the patron saint of Ravenna, was decorated with spectacular mosaics. And in the imperial panels, Charlemagne could see the Emperor Justinian fully crowned, holding a chalice filled with gold coins, but wearing all the imperial garb, the regalia of a real emperor. That is to say, an enormous crown and pearl earrings, a purple cloak with a very large jeweled shoulder piece holding it on his shoulder. And below the imperial cloak, a beautiful embroidered silk tunic and red boots on his feet. And opposite, the Empress Theodora, even more gloriously attained, if that's possible, in, again, an enormous crown and huge earrings and many, many jewels decorating her exquisite costume. The emperor is accompanied by a group of guards in ceremonial dress, very colorful, and a group of clerics, including the Bishop Maximian, who dedicated the church. And Theodora is accompanied by several very beautifully dressed ladies in waiting, wearing silk costumes of exquisite colors, and a group of clerics who hold back a curtain as if she is going to progress through that curtain to the high altar of the Church of Ravenna, because the panels are either side of the altar and the imperial processions are being led by the emperor and empress towards the altar where they will deposit their gifts. The emperor has his bowl, a chalice, and the empress has the chalice and the emperor has the bowl. And in this way, they participate in the liturgy and they show how the emperor and empress worship in the church. And their presence is something that Charlemagne must have noticed. He was there 3 times, and I'm quite sure that he was taken to the church because it was so splendid, where he saw how to be an emperor. He'd been in Rome. There are many churches in Rome, but there are no representations of imperial rulers of the 7th and 8th and 9th centuries that compare with these imperial panels of the 6th century erected in the Church of San Vitale. And I'm sure that Charlemagne went there and looked at the picture of Justinian and thought, yes, that's what I must do. That's how I shall live as emperor. And on his last visit, he really was emperor. He had been crowned by Pope Leo III, and he had been hailed as emperor of the Romans. This was, of course, a tremendous challenge to the emperors of Constantinople, who considered themselves Roman emperors, and they knew that there were no other Roman emperors. But they had to come to terms with Charlemagne, and it's with the Emperor Charles that we begin to see the formation of something that is quite distinctly European culture. And I argue that it draws very substantially on the traditions of symbiosis that had been manifested in Ravenna that made it such an exceptional city in this period that I've covered. Just one last word about the fate of Ravenna, because as I said, after it had been conquered by the Lombards, it was no longer central to Italian government. It was no longer a great rival to the Church of Rome. It receded from historical knowledge. But there's a very interesting fact that because it was a well-endowed church, most of its monuments were kept in in use. And because there were clergy officiating at liturgies and holding their services, these churches continued in use and did not fall into disuse or disrepair. And indeed, some of the secular monuments were adapted for new use. The mausoleum of Theoderic, which is an amazing and huge tomb, like most Roman tombs, like the great tomb of Diocletian at Split, or the tombs of the emperors at Castel San Angelo in Rome. This enormous structure was adapted for use as a nunnery. And in this way, the most striking buildings in Ravenna were kept in use, and they were not repaired, and their old mosaic decoration was not destroyed to make way for new-fangled, new-fashioned decoration. And that is why, even today, Ravenna is such a jewel of early Christian mosaic decoration. And as I argue, it is the forerunner of early Christendom. It looked forward to the year when all Christendom, all the West, would be Christianized. There would no longer be any pagan Saxons beating at the frontiers. And the rule of Christ would come to the West, and Europe would be its own unit, its own self-contained and brilliant Christian unit. And that, I think, is why we should think again about the term late antiquity, as it seems to me to look very much back to the pagan Greco-Roman past, as if the new Christian culture could never rival what the ancients had discovered. And of course, in many ways, that is true. But they adapted what they did know of ancient culture, and they had the Greek and Latin classics translated, and they used them and reused them and copied them. In Constantinople, indeed, they copied many of the Greek dramas from the ancient world, which are no longer, I mean, we know that there were many, many more plays than we have today, Sophocles, Euripides, and so on. But many of them were copied by scribes in Constantinople, in Byzantium. So the Christian cultures of the Middle Ages used that ancient learning, but they built a new early Christendom. And that's why I think this Ravenna is such a leading light and such an important city in this new world which was coming into existence, which is why I think it can claim the title Crucible of Europe. Thank you.